Sometime in the weeks after May 10th, 1977, in an attorney's office in Manhattan, a last will and testament was opened and read aloud. The document was dated October 28th, 1976. It was typed on legal paper, organized with the precision you would expect from a woman who had spent 50 years controlling how the world perceived her. There were bequests to household staff. There were trust funds for two of her daughters. There were contributions to charities. And there, between the names of loyal employees and the amounts assigned to friends, was a single sentence directed at two of her 4 adopted children. No provision had been made for them, for reasons which are well known to them. No explanation followed. No letter was attached. The woman who wrote it was already dead, and the 2 children she had named and excluded in the same breath would never have the chance to ask her what the reasons were. The woman was Joan Crawford, Oscar winner, self-made star, one of the most famous faces of the 20th century, and a mother whose public image of glamour, discipline, and devotion was so complete that for decades, nobody outside the family thought to question it. Inside the family, 4 adopted children had been questioning it their entire lives, and they had arrived at 4 different answers. This is the story of those 4 children, what they experienced inside that house, what they said about it after Joan was gone, and why they could never agree. It spans 5 decades, 2 contested childhoods, a best-selling memoir that became an American myth, a film that turned private pain into public camp, and a family argument that outlived 3 of the 4 people who carried it. In the spring of 1977, in a law office in Manhattan, a document was read aloud that contained a single sentence no one in the room would ever forget. Joan Crawford had died on May 10th in her apartment on Fifth Avenue. The memorial service had been held. George Cukor had called her the perfect image of the movie star. Her 4 adopted children, Christina, Christopher, Cathy, and Cindy, had sat together in the church. The last time all 4 of them would occupy the same room for the same reason. And now the will was open, typed on legal paper, dated October 28th, 1976, and inside it, between the bequests to household staff and the trust funds for the twins, was this. Joan Crawford had made no provision for Christina or Christopher, for reasons which are well known to them. 7 words, no explanation, no appeal. A mother's final act of control, delivered from beyond the reach of any argument her children could make. Joan Crawford was one of the most famous women in the history of American entertainment. A self-made star who had risen from poverty, survived 5 decades in Hollywood, and built a public image of glamour, discipline, and maternal devotion so complete that no one outside the family questioned it. Behind that image, 4 children grew up inside a house they would spend the rest of their lives describing in 4 irreconcilable ways. This is the story of those children, what they experienced, what they claimed, and what they lost. It spans adoptions, estrangements, a will contest, a best-selling memoir, a film that turned a family's pain into American camp, and nearly 50 years of an argument that was never settled, because the people who lived it could not agree on what had happened inside the same home. To understand how a mother's last sentence became the opening argument in a family war that lasted nearly 50 years, you have to go back, not to the will, not to the funeral, not to the book that turned a private household into a national spectacle, but to the woman herself, before Hollywood, before the children, before the name Joan Crawford existed at all. Because the house those children grew up in, the rules, the rituals, the punishments, the expectations that one daughter would later describe as love and another would describe as abuse, did not begin in Brentwood or on the Pepsi-Cola board or under studio lights. It began in poverty, in a place no one was watching, with a girl who learned very early that survival meant performance, that performance meant control, and that the alternative to both was to be forgotten entirely. She was born Lucille Fay LeSueur in San Antonio, Texas. The exact year has never been fully settled. Britannica notes uncertainty around 1904. The Texas State Historical Association records 1906. That small, stubborn discrepancy is itself a kind of origin story, because almost nothing about Joan Crawford's early life was stable enough to be pinned down with confidence. Her father, Thomas LeSueur, left the family when Lucille was young, not with an explanation, not with a forwarding address, just gone. The way men left families in small Texas towns at the turn of the century, and the girl he left behind would spend the rest of her life making sure that no one she depended on would ever have the opportunity to disappear without her permission again. Her mother, Annabelle Johnson, remarried a man named Henry Casson and moved the children to Lawton, Oklahoma, where Lucille grew up under the Casson surname in a household defined by financial instability, physical labor, and the grinding daily awareness that nothing she had was guaranteed. She scrubbed floors. She worked in exchange for meals and schooling at a boarding institution where the line between student and servant was blurred past recognition. She was not a child who received. She was a child who earned. And she internalized that distinction so deeply, so completely, so permanently, that it became the organizing principle of her entire adult life. The conviction that nothing was given, that everything was owed, and that the people who forgot the truth deserved whatever they got. There is something about that childhood worth sitting with for a moment, because the woman it produced makes no sense without it. Joan Crawford's later obsession with discipline, cleanliness, presentation, gratitude, and control, the qualities that would define her household, and depending on which of her children you believe, either prepare them for life or damage them irreparably, did not begin on a studio lot. They began in rooms where nothing was certain, where no one was watching out for her, where the only reliable fact was the effort might keep you alive and its absence would not. The little girl who scrubbed and worked and danced and remade herself became the woman who expected the people around her, especially her children, to understand that the world owed you nothing, that everything had to be earned, and that gratitude was not a feeling. It was an obligation, a debt, the price of being kept. That does not prove any of the allegations that came later. It does not excuse them either. What it does is explain the emotional architecture of the house those 4 children would eventually grow up inside. Joan Crawford did not invent her rules in a vacuum. She inherited them from deprivation and carried them forward into wealth, fame, and motherhood with the absolute conviction that she was protecting her children from the only thing she had ever truly feared, becoming the kind of person the world forgets. People who grow up with nothing often believe that discipline is love, that strictness is preparation, that making things hard for a child is the surest way to make the child strong. Sometimes they are right. Sometimes the discipline becomes something the disciplinarian cannot see, because seeing it would require admitting that the thing she survived also broke something inside her, and that admission is more dangerous than any wire hanger. Joan arrived in Hollywood in the early 1920s as a chorus girl and waitress with an angular face, a jaw that would become one of the most photographed in American history, and no connections whatsoever. She had danced her way out of Oklahoma, performing in revues and small stage productions, and when she reached Los Angeles, she entered a world that ran on beauty, connections, and the willingness to be remade. A studio-sponsored name contest gave her the name Joan Crawford. She did not choose it. She learned to inhabit it so completely that the girl from Lawton, Oklahoma, the girl named Lucille, who scrubbed floors and earned meals, vanished inside it. The new name was a new self, manufactured entirely, and Joan wore it the way she wore her costumes, with total commitment as if it had always been hers. Her rise was one of American entertainment's great acts of self-construction. She danced in revues. She took bit parts. She studied other actresses not for inspiration, but for engineering, watching how they moved, how they were lit, how they used their bodies and faces and voices to claim the camera's attention, and then she replicated what worked and discarded what did not. By the late 1920s, she had become a star, the jazz-age flapper of our dancing daughters, a 1928 film that sold a particular kind of modern female energy, reckless, glamorous, sexually alive. The irony was that the woman playing the role was none of those things when the camera stopped rolling. Off-screen, Joan Crawford was calculating, strategic, tireless, and deeply frightened that everything she had built could be taken away at any moment, because she knew from personal experience that it could. What followed was one of the longest sustained reinventions in Hollywood history. The New York Times, in an obituary written decades later, described Joan's career as a study in determination, discipline, and relentless self-training. A woman who used makeup, coiffure, costume, and craft to keep remaking herself long past the point when other stars had faded into retirement or obscurity. She moved from flapper to shop girl to sophisticated career woman to melodrama queen, and each transformation was deliberate, calculated, and executed with the discipline of someone who understood that standing still in Hollywood meant falling behind. She survived the transition from silent film to talkies, a shift that destroyed careers around her. She survived the devastating professional blow of the late 1930s, when a group of independent theater exhibitors labeled her, along with several other major stars, as box office poison. That phrase would have ended most careers. Joan survived it by accepting roles other actresses considered beneath them, working harder than she had ever worked, and understanding something that most of her contemporaries never grasped, that a star's image was not a gift bestowed by a studio. It was a machine she had to build, maintain, and rebuild constantly, or it would rust and stop. The key to understanding Joan Crawford, and by extension, to understanding the household her children grew up in, is this. Glamour, for Joan, was not luxury. Glamour was labor. The fur coats, the sculpted cheekbones, the posture that could hold an entire room still, the shoulder pads that became her visual signature, the personal replies to fan letters. She reportedly answered thousands herself, maintaining a correspondence with admirers that would have exhausted a professional secretary, the meticulous cultivation of public loyalty, the photographs in which every hair was placed and every shadow considered and every angle calibrated. All of it was work, every minute of it. Britannica describes the glamorous screen image of the fur-draped, successful career woman, and that image was real insofar as Joan inhabited it completely, lived inside it the way other people live inside their skin. But it was also constructed, it built piece by piece from nothing, maintained through effort that never stopped. And Joan never forgot what nothing felt like. That memory made her formidable and charismatic and deeply feared, and it also made her almost impossible to live with because she applied the same standards to her home that she applied to her career. And in a home, unlike on a set, the people around you are not being paid to meet those standards, and they did not sign a contract agreeing to perform. Joan wanted children. She could not have them biologically, and so she adopted, and the story of how she assembled her family carries the same quality of intention, control, and relentless self-direction that characterize every other project she undertook. She adopted a daughter, Christina, in 1940. Christina was born around 1939. Joan was then in the final years of her marriage to her second husband, the actor Franco Tone, a relationship already deteriorating. Christina was the first child Joan kept, the beginning of the family she wanted, the domestic image she intended to build alongside the professional one. A young, famous, beautiful actress with an adopted baby daughter. The photographs wrote themselves. In 1942, Joan adopted a baby boy and named him Christopher. But that first Christopher was reclaimed by his birth mother shortly afterward. A quiet, devastating loss that almost never appears in the public narrative of the Crawford family, but that sits beneath everything that followed like a crack in a foundation. Joan had taken a child into her home, given him a name, begun building the family portrait, and the child was taken back. The wound was private. Joan's response to it was not. In 1943, during her marriage to actor Philip Terry, she adopted another boy and gave him the same name, Christopher, again. The same name, as if repetition could overwrite loss, as if calling the second child by the first child's name could repair the break in the narrative. It was a small, telling act, the act of a woman who believed she could control outcomes by controlling names, images, and the story that surrounded them. And then the twins. In 1947, Joan adopted two infant girls from the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Cathy and Cindy were born on January 13th, 1947. Their adoption was arranged before birth. Their biological mother died less than a week after they were born. 7 days, and then she was gone, and the two girls she had carried were placed into a system that would determine their lives without their knowledge or consent. The agency that facilitated the adoption, run by a woman named Georgia Tenn, would later become one of the most notorious adoption operations in American history, exposed for what amounted to a black market ring. Children separated from families through coercion, paperwork forged, biological parents lied to, and children placed with adoptive families who paid for the privilege without knowing the full circumstances of how their children had been obtained. Whether Joan Crawford knew the scope of the agency's practices is not documented. What can be said is that Cathy and Cindy arrived in the Crawford household carrying an origin they would not learn the details of for more than 4 decades. And when they finally went searching for that origin in their mid-40s, the story they found would carry its own devastation. Separate from Joan, separate from Christina, separate from the argument that had consumed the rest of the family. 4 children then. Christina, the eldest, adopted in 1940. Christopher, adopted in 1943. Cathy and Cindy, born January 13th, 1947, adopted as infants. One mother, one of the most recognized names in American entertainment, and a household assembled with the same discipline, intention, and need for control that Joan applied to everything she touched. By 1944, Joan Crawford's career appeared to be finished. She had left Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer after 18 years, the last several of which had been spent making films that nobody watched and absorbing the humiliation of being labeled a liability by the very industry she had given her adult life to. She signed with Warner Brothers, took a pay cut, and accepted a role that the studio's bigger stars had turned down. The film was Mildred Pierce. The decision to take the part, a woman who has been dismissed, who has been told she's past her usefulness, who refuses to accept the verdict and rebuilds herself through sheer force of will, was, for Joan, not just a career move. It was autobiography. Joan won the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1946 for Mildred Pierce. And the film matters here, not for the career milestone, but for what the role contained. She played Mildred, a self-made woman from a modest background who works herself to exhaustion to give her daughter a better life. And the daughter responds with contempt, entitlement, cruelty, and betrayal. Mildred's love and Mildred's control become so entangled that the audience cannot separate devotion from damage, sacrifice from suffocation. Joan reportedly watched the Oscar ceremony from her bedroom, claiming illness, and accepted the statuette in a bed jacket with photographers she had invited to capture the moment. Even the triumph was managed. Even the recognition was a performance. And the role for which she won, the ambitious mother whose sacrifices are thrown back in her face by an ungrateful daughter, would prove, in retrospect, to be the most uncomfortable mirror of her own story that Hollywood ever provided. The family photographs from the late 1940s and early 1950s present the public version of the Crawford household. A portrait session on November 13th, 1950, captured Joan with all 4 children in Hollywood. Christina and Christopher flanking their mother. Cathy and Cindy, the younger pair, positioned in front. Joan is centered, composed, dressed with the precision she brought to everything. The children are arranged. The composition implies harmony, belonging, a family that functions. It is the kind of image that gets reprinted in magazine features and fan publications, and later, when the argument begins, cited by both sides. By the defenders as proof of a loving family, by Christina as proof of a woman who could stage anything. The household Joan ran was organized around order and expectation. The children did chores. They followed rules. They maintained standards of appearance, behavior, and gratitude that would have been demanding in any home, and were made more so by the fact that the mother enforcing them was one of the most visible women in the country. Joan's house was clean, the way a set is clean, meticulously, deliberately, as if disorder were not just untidiness, but moral failure. The beds were made, the closets were arranged, the children's clothes were pressed, their hair was combed, their manners were rehearsed. It was a household built for inspection, and the inspector was always present. Cindy, or one of the twins, later described the domestic structure in terms that sounded reasonable, even character building. She said the children were washing dishes beginning at 4 or 5 years old, standing on step stools at the kitchen sink, learning to handle plates and cups, developing the habits of responsibility before they were old enough to understand the word. She said her worst punishment was eating cold dinner for breakfast the next morning. The meal she had refused the night before, placed in front of her again, a lesson in waste and gratitude delivered through leftovers. She said, clearly and without hedging, that she never once saw Joan drunk. From Cindy's account, Joan was strict and demanding, but the demands were directed at producing capable, independent adults who could take care of themselves. The house had rules. The rules had consequences. The consequences were proportionate. That was Cindy's experience, and she held to it her entire life. For Christina, the same household produced an account so different, it is difficult to believe the 2 women were describing the same home. Christina would later allege that Joan was volatile, alcoholic, physically abusive, and psychologically controlling, that behind the closed doors of the Crawford house, the discipline Cindy called structure was actually domination. The rules were instruments of power, and Joan's behavior included episodes of rage and violence that the public never saw and the younger children never witnessed. The wire hanger episode, Joan's alleged discovery of wire hangers in Christina's closet and the violent response that followed, would eventually become the most recognizable image of maternal abuse in 20th century American culture. But in the early 1950s, none of this was public. Joan Crawford was the glamorous actress, the devoted mother, the woman who had built everything from nothing and expected her children to appreciate the construction. The asymmetry of the family is the key to understanding everything that followed. Christina and Christopher were the older children, raised during Joan's most pressured years. Years of career anxiety, failing marriages, and the relentless effort to maintain an image that could be destroyed by a single bad photograph or a single flop. Christina was brought onto studio lots as an infant, introduced to directors and producers before she could talk, educated in the mechanics of fame before she had the vocabulary to question it. She experienced Joan not as a parent, but as an institution. Movie star, employer, judge, benefactor, rival, gatekeeper. And there is no instruction manual for being raised inside an institution that also calls itself your mother. Christopher was quieter. The boy adopted during the Philip Terry marriage, renamed after the divorce. A child whose very name had been assigned, revoked, and reassigned by the woman who controlled the household. First given to a baby who was taken back, then passed to a replacement child as if names were transferable property, like furniture or jewelry. Christopher Crawford was, in the most literal sense, his mother's second attempt at a son. Whether he knew this, and when he learned it, and what that knowledge did to a boy growing up inside a family defined by performance and image, belongs to the private history that Christopher himself never chose to make public. What is visible is a child who appeared in the family photographs but generated fewer headlines than his sister, whose difficulties were quieter and more internal, whose pain did not have the narrative force of Christina's and therefore attracted less attention. From the press, from the public, and it would seem from the family myth itself. Cathy and Cindy arrived when Christina was 7. By the time the twins could form lasting memories, Christina was approaching adolescence, and Christopher was already accumulating his own troubles. The twins grew up during a different phase of Joan's life. Still disciplined, still controlled, but past the worst of the career panic and the marital collapses. Whether the twins experienced a genuinely different mother or experienced the same mother and interpreted her differently is the question the family never settled. What is certain is that the age gap created 2 separate childhoods inside the same house. The 4 children shared an address, a surname, and a famous mother. They did not share the same experience of any of those things. Joan's 4 marriages mapped additional instability onto the family. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. came first, a youthful Hollywood union that ended quickly. Then Francho Tone, a more serious attachment that deteriorated into public difficulty. Then Philip Terry, the marriage during which Christopher was adopted and after which Christopher lost his surname. Then Alfred Steele, the chairman of Pepsi-Cola, whose marriage to Joan in 1955 brought her into a corporate world that would replace Hollywood as her primary stage. After Steele's death in 1959, Joan stayed on the Pepsi board, attending corporate functions, maintaining the image of a woman who could not be stopped by loss or age or the disappearance of the world that had made her. Each husband brought a different atmosphere to the household. Each departure reorganized the children's lives around a new absence. They watched men arrive and leave. They absorbed the transitions without being asked whether they could manage them. By the mid-1950s, the Crawford family appeared to be the completed thing Joan had spent years building. 4 children, a famous mother, a house run with precision and expectation, a public image of domestic achievement to match the professional one. But the children were aging, and aging the development of independent thought, the capacity for resistance, the slow emergence of people who could see the gap between what the household demanded and what it actually was the one thing Joan's system could not absorb. Christina put it in a sentence that captures everything. She wrote that they had made a fatal error. They started growing up. They started becoming people. In Joan Crawford's household, becoming a person, someone with opinions, resistance, a perspective that diverged from the mother's, was not maturity. It was betrayal. It was ingratitude made flesh. In 1958, the first public crack appeared. Christopher Crawford was 15 years old. He was not living with Joan at the time, but staying with a child psychiatrist named Dr. Earl Loomis on Long Island. A placement whose full circumstances were never widely reported, but whose mere existence told a story. A child removed from the family home, placed with a mental health professional, living apart from the mother the public believed was raising him in a disciplined, loving household. While staying with Dr. Loomis, Christopher took an air rifle and shot out streetlights and school windows in the surrounding neighborhood. The incident made the local newspapers. In isolation, it was minor. A teenage boy, a BB gun, some shattered glass. But the details that accompanied it could not be explained away. A psychiatrist's name, a child not living at home, a famous mother whose domestic story suddenly had a visible crack, and a boy expressing something through destruction because he had no other language available to him. Christina's adolescence ran on a parallel track. Joan sent her to boarding school, an act that Christina would later frame not as education, but as removal, as the expulsion of a child who had grown too difficult to manage, too old to arrange in photographs, too close to independent personhood to remain safely inside the Crawford household. From Joan's perspective, if she ever articulated one, the boarding school was an investment, the kind of institutional structure that a disciplined, ambitious mother would naturally seek for a daughter she wanted to succeed. From Christina's perspective, it was exile. She was being sent away from the house where the damage was occurring, and the younger children who remained behind would grow up in that house without her, forming their own memories of a mother Christina believed they were too young and too sheltered to accurately assess. The boarding school year separated Christina from the younger children physically, and that physical separation became the permanent structural fracture in the family's collective memory. It created two Joans, the Joan who existed before Christina left, which only Christina and Christopher remembered, and the Joan who existed afterward, which was the only Joan that Cathy and Cindy knew. Christina would argue for the rest of her life that Cathy, who was 2 years old when Christina was sent away, could not possibly have witnessed what Christina and Christopher experienced, that the twins' defense of Joan was sincere but built on an incomplete record, the testimony of people who arrived at the scene after the worst of it had already occurred. The family was now operating on two tracks that would never converge. Publicly, Joan was the actress, the Pepsi representative, the star who had survived every assault Hollywood could mount against her. Privately, two of her children were becoming people she could not script, and two were still young enough to remain inside the version of the family she needed to present to the world. Joan begins speaking of the older children not as wounded but as ungrateful, children who had been given everything and refused to pay the debt she believed they owed. The children were growing up, and in Joan Crawford's house, growing up was the one thing the mother could not forgive. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There's so much more to this family that the public never saw. I mean, we're just getting started. The distance between Joan Crawford and her two eldest children widened across the 1960s in a pattern that was visible to those who knew the family and invisible to everyone who did not. Christina Crawford became an actress, not a film star on her mother's scale, not a woman whose name alone could open a film or sell a magazine, but a working professional who found steady employment on the CBS soap opera, The Secret Storm. The career choice was natural in one sense. Christina had grown up inside the entertainment industry, brought to studio lots as an infant, introduced to directors and producers before she could understand what their titles meant, raised in the grammar of cameras and lighting and call times and public performance the way other children were raised in the grammar of schoolyard games. Acting was the family business, and Christina entered it because it was the language she spoke. It was impossible in another sense, because the surname Crawford carried a weight that no amount of individual talent could lift away from you. Every audition, every role, every review existed inside the gravity of Joan's fame. Joan spoke publicly about Christina's upbringing with the pride of a mother offering a tour of the family enterprise. She told the New York Times in 1968 that Christina had been brought to sets as a baby, that she had spent her childhood surrounded by actors and directors, that entertainment was her birthright. Joan framed this as generosity, as doors opened, opportunities provided, access granted to a wall most aspiring actresses would never enter. From Christina's later account, it looked different. She had not chosen the entertainment world. She had been placed inside it before she had the capacity to consent or refuse, raised inside her mother's professional mythology, without any separation between Joan the performer and Joan the parent. When Christina tried to work as an adult, she could never be certain whether anything she achieved belonged to her or to the name. Christopher Crawford's path diverged entirely. He enlisted in the United States Army and was stationed in Vietnam at 25 years old. The distance he put between himself and Joan's world was not merely geographic, and it was existential. Joan's universe was Hollywood premieres, Pepsi-Cola corporate receptions, fan letters, and the relentless management of public image. Christopher's was a military base in a war zone on the other side of the world, a place where the name Crawford meant nothing, where nobody cared who your mother was or how many Oscars she had won, where the rules that governed your survival had nothing to do with wire hangers or thank you notes or the proper way to set a table, whether the enlistment was motivated by patriotism, by the need to escape, or by the particular kind of despair that drives young men from difficult homes into dangerous environments is something the public record does not reveal and should not presume to settle. What can be said is that Christopher chose a world as far from Joan's as the planet offered, a world of mud and danger and anonymous service, and that the choice itself was a kind of testimony about what the world he was leaving had done to him. Christina would later say that Christopher supported her account of their childhood, that he had experienced the same household she described, that he had agreed with what she eventually wrote, even though he chose not to write it himself. His alignment with Christina was consistent. He joined the will contest. He stood on her side of the family divide, but it was never performed. Christopher Crawford's response to the Crawford household was not testimony and not advocacy. It was withdrawal. He had seen what he had seen. He chose not to submit it for public review. Cathy and Cindy, now moving through their late teens and into their 20s, remained closer to Joan. They were the pair who had arrived as infants, grown up during a later and, depending on whom you believe, calmer chapter of Joan's life, and whose experience of the Crawford household did not match what Christina would describe. Cindy told interviewers that Joan was caring and loving, that she was strict in the way a parent who wants independent children is strict, that the chores and the expectations were preparation for adulthood, not punishments disguised as lessons. She said, clearly and without qualification, that she never once saw Joan drunk, a direct contradiction of one of Christina's central claims, offered not as a rhetorical strategy, but as a statement of lived experience. Cindy did not argue that Christina was lying. She said that what Christina described was not what Cindy saw. The distinction is important because it leaves open the possibility that both accounts are true, that Joan was one thing in one room and another thing in another room, that the mother who terrified Christina and the mother who raised Cindy were the same woman, and that the difference between them was not one of fact, but of which child was standing in front of her and when. Cathy went further, calling Joan the best mother anyone could have asked for, and she said it with a conviction that did not waver across 4 decades of public debate. The gap between the older and younger children was not only emotional, it was structural, temporal, and insurmountable. Christina and Christopher had lived through Joan's most pressured working years, through the marriages to Frances Tone and Philip Terry, through the career crisis of the box office poison period, through the era when Joan's need to manage every detail of her public and private existence was at its most acute and its most volatile. Cathy and Cindy arrived later, after the Oscar, after the worst of the career fear had passed, during Joan's marriage to Alfred Steele and the relative stability that Pepsi-Cola brought. Whether Joan was a genuinely different mother to the younger pair or whether the younger pair were simply more temperamentally compliant is a question that cannot be answered from the outside. Both explanations are possible. Both may be partially true at the same time. And the impossibility of resolving the question is the thing that makes the Crawford family story unfixable. Not a mystery with a solution waiting to be discovered, but a permanent ambiguity that the people who lived it could never agree on. Joan's own presentation of the family shifted during the 1960s. She was no longer the young, glamorous mother of magazine photographs. She was the aging star whose most memorable recent role had been opposite Bette Davis in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? A 1962 film about 2 sisters locked inside a decaying Hollywood mansion, trapped together by old grievances, mutual dependence, and a shared past they could neither escape nor reconcile. Joan played the part of a woman held captive by a family member, and she played it with the authority of someone who understood confinement from the inside. The film was a critical and commercial success, and its themes, sisters destroying each other, fame rotting into bitterness, the past refusing to release its hold, hung over the Crawford family story like weather that would not break. The film also marked the last significant chapter of Joan's career as a leading actress. She would continue to work through the 1960s, taking roles in horror films and genre pictures that were a long way from the glamour of her peak years. And the distance between the image she had built and the role she was accepting carried its own quiet humiliation. Joan Crawford, the woman who had once embodied sophistication and determination for an entire nation of moviegoers, was now appearing in films that required her to be menaced, degraded, and physically threatened on screen. She took the work because she had always taken the work. Because working was who she was, because the alternative to working was invisibility, and she feared invisibility the way other people feared death. But the pride she carried into each diminishing role did not diminish the fact that the world she had mastered was disappearing around her. After Alfred Steele died in 1959, Joan moved deeper into the corporate world. She remained on the Pepsi-Cola board, attended events, maintained the image of a woman who could reinvent herself past any loss. But the reinventions were growing more effortful. Hollywood was gone. Not Joan's Hollywood of studios and long-term contracts and carefully managed star images, but the entire system that had given her structure, purpose, and an audience that felt personally invested in her survival. The family she had constructed was fragmenting along fault lines she could not mend, because mending them would have required something Joan Crawford was constitutionally unable to do. Consider the possibility that the way she had raised her children was not merely strict but destructive, and that the gratitude she demanded was not love but control wearing a different name. Joan once said something about Christina that revealed the entire foundation of how she understood motherhood. She told people that the problem with Christina was that Joan had adopted her, but Christina had not adopted Joan. Read that sentence again. It frames parenthood not as an unconditional bond between an adult and a child, but as a bilateral agreement between equals. It implies that a child owes the parent the same degree of loyalty and commitment that the parent extended to the child. It treats adoption as a transaction in which gratitude is the currency, and it argues that Christina's failure to pay that currency constituted a breach of contract. Whether this sentence reflects narcissism, woundedness, or the worldview of a woman who had earned everything she ever possessed and could not fathom why her children would not do the same, is a question that produces a different answer, depending on which Crawford child you ask. The family's financial and institutional structure reinforced the emotional one. Joan controlled the money. She controlled access to the Crawford name and its public representation. She controlled the narrative while she was alive, because celebrity in mid-20th century America meant that the famous person's version of events was the version that was printed, broadcast, and believed. A movie star's account of her family was not challenged by her children in public. It was accepted as fact, photographed as truth, and presented as reality. Christina could disagree behind closed doors. Christopher could remove himself to another continent. But Joan Crawford's story about her own motherhood was the official record for as long as Joan Crawford was alive to enforce it. On October 28, 1976, Joan Crawford signed her last will and testament in New York City. She was in declining health, increasingly isolated, no longer actively involved with Pepsi, no longer the woman who walked into corporate boardrooms with the posture of a general and the wardrobe of a star. The world she had inhabited for 5 decades, the world of cameras and premieres and magazine covers and carefully managed public appearances, had contracted to the size of a Manhattan apartment and a shrinking circle of visitors. The will she signed that October day distributed an estate valued at approximately $2 million. Cathy and Cindy each received trust funds of $77,500. Joan left bequests to longtime household employees who had served her with the loyalty she prized. She left money to friends who had remained faithful. She left contributions to charitable causes she cared about. The will was, in most respects, the document of a woman settling her affairs with the same precision she had brought to the rest of her life, deliberate, controlled, every line considered. And then there was the sentence. Joan Crawford made no provision in the will for Christina or Christopher. She did not forget them. She did not leave their names off through the oversight of an aging woman failing to account for her full family. She included them by name for the specific purpose of excluding them, and she provided a single justification. 7 words that would outlive every person the document named, for reasons which are well known to them. That phrase is a particular kind of cruelty, the kind that only a person with deep experience in managing narrative could produce. Well known to them, not well known to the public, not explained in the attached letter. Known to them. The phrase implies that Christina and Christopher already understand why they are being punished and that no further explanation is required. It accuses without offering evidence. It condemns without permitting rebuttal. It turns a legal instrument into the final move in a decades-long argument and ensures that Joan, not Christina, not Christopher, not any lawyer or judge or future biographer, is the one who gets the last word. The will was not a conversation. It was a closing statement delivered by a woman who had spent her entire life controlling how she was perceived, and who intended to control it from beyond the grave. 7 months later, on May 10, 1977, Joan Crawford died in her Manhattan apartment. She was 71 or 73 years old, depending on which birth year is accepted. According to published accounts, she had been living quietly in the apartment for months, her health declining, her public appearances growing fewer. The glamorous social life that had sustained her for decades reduced to a smaller and smaller circle of visitors and telephone calls. The woman who had once commanded the attention of every room she entered was now spending her days largely alone, attended by household staff, managing the final indignity of a body that would not cooperate with the discipline she had imposed on it for a lifetime. Joan Crawford had controlled everything: her image, her career, her household, her children, the way the world perceived her. She could not control this. The New York Times obituary described her as a quintessential superstar who had embodied glamour for generations of American women. Disciplined, professional, adaptable, a woman who had survived the collapse of the studio system and reinvented herself across 5 decades. The obituary was the public Joan captured at the moment of her death, the accomplishment, the image, the legacy. It said nothing about the children she had excluded from her will. It said nothing about the sentence that was waiting inside the legal document she had signed 7 months earlier. The obituary was the last version of Joan Crawford that existed before the family's private story became public property. The memorial service was held at All Souls Unitarian Church in Manhattan. George Cukor, the great Hollywood director who had worked with Joan, called her the perfect image of the movie star. Other industry figures offered eulogies that praised her discipline, her resilience, her absolute commitment to the craft of being Joan Crawford. The church was full of people who had known the public version of this woman, the version she had spent 50 years constructing and defending, and their tributes reflected the version: glamorous, determined, professional, resilient, a survivor. Outside the church, the public mourned a star. Inside the church, 4 adopted children sat in the same room for what may have been the last time: Christina, Christopher, Cathy, Cindy, together. Listening to strangers describe a woman they had each known in a way no stranger could, that may have been the last moment of visible family unity. The ceremony ended, the tributes were given, the public performance of grief was completed, and then the will became public knowledge, and the sentence was read, and the family broke along the fault line that had been building since the children first began to grow up. Christina was 37. Christopher was 33. They were adults who had lived full, independent lives away from Joan's household, and yet the will compressed them back into the roles they had occupied as children: the disobedient ones, the ungrateful ones, the ones who had failed to adopt their mother in return, named and excluded, acknowledged and denied. 2 children informed, in the flattest possible legal language, that they were outside the circle and that they already knew why. Christina and Christopher contested the will. The legal challenge did not overturn the exclusion, but a settlement was reached, and the siblings split $55,000 between them. The amount was modest, a fraction of what Joan left to the twins, a rounding error compared to the estate's total value. But the will contest mattered for reasons beyond money. It established the family argument as a matter of public legal record, visible to anyone who cared to look, documented in a way that private grievances are not. It also complicated the later accusation, made by Joan's defenders and by skeptics of Christina's memoir, that Christina wrote her book purely for financial gain. The financial fight had already happened. The book was going to do something money could not. It was going to answer Joan's sentence. It was going to fill in the reason that Joan had declared well known, but had refused to name. And it was going to ensure that the last word in the Crawford family belonged not to the mother, but to the daughter she had tried to erase from the will. What could accomplish that was a book. 18 months after Joan Crawford's memorial service in the autumn of 1978, William Morrow and Company published Mommie Dearest, a memoir by Christina Crawford. The book was not the first account of life inside a celebrity household, but it was the most devastating, the most specific, and the most willing to name names and describe scenes with the kind of physical detail that made readers feel they were standing inside the room. Christina portrayed Joan as a sadistic, controlling alcoholic mother who inflicted harsh physical and emotional punishments on her children for trivial rule violations, a woman whose public image of glamour and maternal devotion concealed a private reality of rage, cruelty, and the particular kind of domination that is possible only when the person wielding the power also controls the family's public narrative. The wire hanger episode became the book's signature image, Joan discovering wire hangers in Christina's closet and responding with a fury so extreme, so disproportionate to the offense, that it became the single most recognized scene of parental abuse in 20th century American life. The book contained more than the wire hanger scene. It contained scenes of emotional manipulation, public humiliation, midnight rages, physical confrontations, and the relentless enforcement of a domestic regime that Christina described not as discipline, but as tyranny administered by a woman who was incapable of distinguishing between control and love. The book's power lay not just in the severity of the allegations, but in the specificity of the telling. The dates, the locations, the physical details that gave each scene the weight of testimony rather than accusation. The book became a bestseller immediately. It arrived at precisely the moment American culture was ready for this particular kind of story. An era of celebrity exposés, of feminist re-examination of motherhood and its mythologies, of growing public willingness to believe that the distance between a famous woman's public face and her private behavior could be enormous and violent. Christina was not simply accusing her mother. She was dismantling one of the most carefully constructed public images in Hollywood history, and she held the authority of someone who had spent her childhood inside the machinery that produced it. The backlash from Joan's world was immediate. Friends and Hollywood contemporaries denounced the book, defended Joan's memory, and accused Christina of exploiting a woman who could no longer respond. Jack Valenti reportedly questioned whether any public tribute to Joan could have survived had the book preceded her death. Others believed Christina without reservation. Some recognized patterns from their own homes. The public divided along the fault line it always divides along in family disputes. Whose pain deserves belief? And whose testimony do you trust when neither side can prove what happened behind closed doors? In 1981, Paramount Pictures released a film adaptation starring Faye Dunaway. The movie amplified everything the book had started and distorted much of it in the amplification. Dunaway's performance was commanding, physically intense, and so operatic in its emotional register that the film crossed, for many viewers, from drama into something they had not expected, camp. Dunaway had prepared for the role with the same kind of obsessive discipline Joan herself would have recognized, studying Crawford's mannerisms, her posture, the precise way she held a cigarette, the architectural severity of her cheekbones and shoulder pads. The result was a performance so complete, so inhabited, that it obliterated the boundary between portrayal and caricature. Audiences did not know whether to be horrified or entertained, and many decided they could be both at the same time. Critics dismissed it, audiences filled theaters. The wire hanger scene became a midnight screening ritual, then a cultural reference, then a meme before the concept of memes existed, then a phrase that floated free of its origin and attached permanently to Joan Crawford's name. The film was a commercial success and a critical failure, and it accomplished something the book alone could not. It gave the allegations a visual dimension that could be replayed, quoted, imitated, and embedded in American memory permanently. The book had required readers to imagine the scenes Christina described. The film showed them, and once they had been shown, they could not be unseen. Each of Joan's 4 children responded to this cultural earthquake according to who they had become. Christina was the witness who would not retract, the daughter who had seized the family narrative from her dead mother and refused to release it. She had done what the will had tried to prevent. She had taken the last word. Joan's final sentence, for reasons which are well known to them, had been answered by 400 pages of reasons, spelled out in detail that no legal document could counter. Christopher was quietly aligned with Christina, standing on her side of the divide without mounting the stage himself, a man who confirmed his sister's account by proximity rather than proclamation. His silence was not contradiction. It was endorsement delivered in the only form he was willing to offer. Cathy said her mother was the best mother anyone could have had, and she said it with a fierceness that reflected not just loyalty, but personal affront. The accusation against Joan was, for Cathy, an accusation against her own childhood, her own memories, her own understanding of what had been real inside that house. Cindy described Joan as caring, loving, strict, and emphatically not the woman Christina had put on the page. She said, as she had always said, that she had never seen Joan drunk. The twins' accounts did not waver. They would hold their positions for the rest of their lives. The family was now divided by something more permanent and more public than disputed memory: law, money, publication, a film seen by millions, and 4 competing claims to the truth of a single household. These were the instruments that had replaced whatever chance of reconciliation might once have existed. 4 children lived under the same famous roof. They came away carrying 4 incompatible versions of the same mother. And the question the American public would spend the next 4 decades debating was not simply what happened in the Crawford house. It was how a family could share a name and a home and fail so completely to share a single version of what that home had been. The decades after Mommie Dearest did not resolve the Crawford family story. They scattered it across courtrooms and interview transcripts and obituary pages and a cultural afterlife so vast that it eventually consumed the real human beings who had lived through the events it described. The four Crawford children spent the rest of their lives inside an argument that none of them had the power to end, because ending it would have required one side to concede, and neither side could, because what each side believed was rooted not in strategy but in memory. The most private, most stubborn, most unverifiable form of human knowledge there is. Christina Crawford spent her remaining public life fused to the book she had written. The fusion was partly voluntary. She chose to keep speaking, to expand the memoir in later editions, to give interviews, to make a documentary about her childhood and the publication and the film and the aftermath. She became associated with advocacy around child abuse, domestic violence, and the rights of adopted children, lending the authority of her story to causes that extended its argument beyond the walls of the Crawford household and into broader conversations about what happens to children inside families the public admires and refuses to scrutinize. That advocacy work was real and consequential, and it gave the memoir a dimension beyond personal accusation. It made Christina's story part of a larger cultural reckoning, a reckoning with the idea that celebrity confers not just privilege but immunity, that famous parents operate inside a zone of protection that shields them from the questions other parents are forced to answer, and that the children of those parents carry a burden the public cannot see because the public's view is blocked by the very fame that created the problem. Christina also had to contend with the specific cruelty of having her pain turned into entertainment. The 1981 film had taken her most traumatic memories and rendered them as camp spectacle. The scenes she described as the worst moments of her childhood were being shouted back at movie screens by audiences who treated them as comedy. That transformation, from suffering to punchline, from testimony to midnight screening ritual, was something Christina could not control and did not invite. She had written a book about abuse. American popular culture had turned it into a show. The distance between those two things was the distance between the memoir's intention and its afterlife, and Christina occupied that distance for the rest of her career. But the book also became a trap. Once you write the definitive account of your mother's cruelty, and it enters the culture as an American myth, as a phrase people use casually, as a film people quote at midnight screenings, as a cultural shorthand that detaches from its source and becomes free-floating, you do not get to put it down. The memoir becomes the lens through which your entire life is read. People ask about it at dinner parties. Interviewers circle back to it decades later. The woman Christina might have been without it. The actress, the professional, the person with concerns and talents unrelated to Joan, disappears inside the story the same way Joan, the person, had disappeared inside Joan the star. Mother and daughter, trapped by different images, unable to escape either one. Christina never retracted. She never offered a revised version of the narrative in which Joan was complicated but ultimately redeemable. She never moderated the central claim. Her consistency was, depending on your assessment, either the hallmark of a person telling the truth and refusing to be pressured into softening it, or the hallmark of someone who had committed to a narrative so completely that evolution would feel like surrender. Both readings are possible. Neither can be confirmed. Christopher Crawford, the quietest of the four, lived out the decades after Joan's death in a privacy so deliberate it amounted to a philosophy, in a family where every other member eventually assumed a public role. Joan as the star, Christina as the accuser, Cathy and Cindy as the defenders, the audience as the jury. Christopher declined every invitation to perform. He did not write a memoir. He did not sit for extended interviews. He did not appear on talk shows to share his side. He did not build a career from the Crawford name or from the controversy that had made it famous in a way Joan would never have chosen. He had served in Vietnam, a war that broke men in ways the public rarely saw and rarely asked about. And he had come home, and he had built a life on terms that did not require an audience. That choice, quiet as it was, may have been the most radical act of self-preservation any member of the Crawford family managed. In a household that had been built on performance, Christopher's refusal to perform was the one truly subversive act. Christina said Christopher supported her account, and his participation in the will contest placed him formally on her side. But his daily life was not public testimony. It was simply a life. private, unnarrated, conducted away from cameras and courtrooms and the endless cycle of accusation and defense that consumed the rest of the family. The public record of Christopher Crawford is thin, and the thinness is not a research failure. It is the research finding. He chose to leave almost nothing for the record to capture, and in a family where every other member's existence became material for books, films, lawsuits, and cultural commentary, that absence was the closest thing to freedom any of them achieved. Christopher died in 2006. He was 63 years old. He had lived more than half his life after Joan's death, and in all those years, the public never learned much more about him than the basic facts. He was Joan Crawford's adopted son. He had served in Vietnam. He had supported Christina's account, and he had chosen privacy over participation. The family lost a member whose silence had functioned as a kind of integrity that none of the louder positions could match. The integrity of a man who had experienced something real and refused to auction his pain for public consumption. Christina lost her most important private corroboration, the brother who had been there, who had seen what she saw, whose agreement with her version of events could not be dismissed as self-interest because he had never sought anything from it. Cathy and Cindy lost a brother whose quiet alignment with Christina had been for decades the one piece of corroboration from their side of the family that they could not fully explain away. And the public, which had never really known Christopher well enough to form an opinion of him, barely registered his passing, because the public's version of the Crawford story had exactly 4 roles: the villain, the accuser, and the 2 loyal daughters, and Christopher had never fit any of them. Cathy Crawford Lalonde's life after Joan's death was the most active and most combative of the defenders' paths. She married Jerome Lalonde in 1968 and had 2 children of her own. A fact that matters because it meant Cathy experienced motherhood from the other side, raised children with whatever tools her own upbringing had given her, and still concluded that Joan's approach had been fundamentally sound. The marriage to Lalonde eventually ended in separation and later divorce, and Cathy navigated those personal upheavals, the particular loneliness of a single mother, the reorganization of a household around an absent spouse, while simultaneously carrying the burden of a public argument about her dead mother that showed no signs of resolution. Where Christina had made accusation the organizing principle of her public life, Cathy made defense the organizing principle of hers. The defense was not passive. Cathy did not simply decline to comment when asked about Mommie Dearest, or offer mild diplomatic disagreements that preserve family peace. She challenged Christina's account actively, publicly, and with a specificity that reflected genuine anger. The anger of a woman who believed her mother was being slandered by her own sister, and that the world's eagerness to believe this slander was a failure not just of fairness, but of basic decency. Cathy insisted that Joan had been strict but not abusive, demanding but not cruel, that the household had been organized around preparing children for the real world, and that Christina's book was a distortion manufactured by someone who had never forgiven Joan for the will and could not separate her grief from her imagination. The defense became legal in the late 1990s. Christina had publicly questioned whether Cathy and Cindy were biological twins, a challenge that targeted not just the twins' family narrative, but their fundamental identity, the most basic fact of who they were and how they came into the world. For Cathy, this was the line that could not be crossed. She could tolerate Christina's accusations against Joan, could endure the book and the film and the cultural afterlife that turned her mother into a punchline, but she could not accept an attack on the twins' very origins. Cathy sued Christina for defamation. The case resolved in 1999 with a verdict in Cathy's favor, $5,000 in damages plus court costs. The financial award was negligible, less than the cost of the legal proceedings that produced it. The principle was not. Cathy's attorney said they had proved their point, and the point was clear, that the right to define your own identity and origin belongs to you, not to the family member who has appointed herself the sole narrator of everyone's story. But the twins' most important journey had nothing to do with Christina and nothing to do with Joan's memory. In 1991, Cathy and Cindy traveled to Tennessee to search for the biological family they had never known. They were 44 years old. They had lived their entire conscious lives inside the Crawford story, adopted, raised, defended, defined by a mother whose fame had turned their private identities into contested public property. Now they were driving through a state they had never visited, searching for people whose names they had only recently learned, trying to understand where they came from before Joan Crawford decided where they would go. What they found was both simple and devastating in the way that simple things can devastate when they arrive 44 years late. Their biological mother had died 7 days after giving birth to them. 7 days. She had carried them for 9 months, delivered them, lived long enough to know they existed, and then she was gone. Before they could open their eyes, before she could hold them long enough to give them names, before any of the things that a mother and child are supposed to share in the first week of life had a chance to begin. The twins had grown up knowing they were adopted, knowing Joan was not their biological mother, but that knowledge had been abstract, a fact about their origin, not an experience they had felt. Standing in Tennessee, learning that the woman who gave birth to them had survived the delivery by less than a week made the abstraction concrete. They were alive because she had been alive, and she had been gone almost as soon as they arrived. Their biological father was still living. He was an old man by then, residing in a farmhouse in West Tennessee, and Cindy later said he was happy they came. The scene is specific and quiet and almost unbearably human. Two middle-aged women standing before a man connected to them by blood and separated from them by an entire lifetime, all three trying to build a bridge across the gap that 44 years of silence had carved too wide to fully cross. He had known he had children. He had not known where they had gone. They had known they had parents somewhere. They had not known where to look. And now they were all standing in the same room, and the room could not hold everything that needed to be said. That Tennessee trip reveals something about Cathy and Cindy that the Joan-Christina argument tends to flatten. The twins were not merely Joan Crawford's loyal daughters, cast by the public as supporting players in someone else's family drama. They were adoptees with a missing origin of their own, products of an adoption system later exposed as deeply corrupt, women who carried questions about identity, belonging, and biological connection that had nothing whatsoever to do with wire hangers, Hollywood, or the argument between Christina and the rest of the family. They had their own grief, they had their own search, they had their own wound. The wound of not knowing where you come from, of discovering that the system that brought you to your mother was the same system that may have stolen other children from theirs. The public's reduction of Cathy and Cindy to the daughters who defended Joan was its own form of erasure, and the Tennessee farmhouse was the proof. Cindy died in 2007. She was 60 years old. She had spent her final decades maintaining the same position she had articulated since 1978, that Joan was a loving mother, that the household was strict but not abusive, that Mommie Dearest was a distortion she could not accept as truth. Cindy's death came 1 year after Christopher's, and the proximity of those losses carried its own weight. In the span of 12 months, the Crawford family lost 2 of Joan's 4 adopted children, one from each side of the family divide, the quiet accuser and one of the active defenders, and the public barely registered either departure. The reason for that public indifference is itself part of the story. By 2006, by 2007, the Crawford family argument had been running for nearly 3 decades, and the public's relationship with it had long since calcified into a set of fixed positions that no new development, no death, no revelation, no recantation could shift. Joan was either a monster or a misunderstood mother. Christina was either courageous or mercenary. The twins were either loyal witnesses or willful deniers. The positions had hardened into identities and the actual people behind them. People who woke up in the morning and ate breakfast and worried about their health and had moments of private happiness that had nothing to do with the famous argument, had been reduced to roles in a cultural production that no longer needed their participation to keep running. The argument had become self-sustaining. The people were optional. Cathy survived her twin sister by 13 years. She continued to defend Joan in interviews, continued to insist that her experience of her mother was valid and that Mommie Dearest was a distortion of the household she had known. She watched Christopher die, then Cindy, and still she held her ground. The last of Joan's defenders, the final living voice that could say from personal experience that the Joan Crawford she knew was not the Joan Crawford the world believed in. There is something both admirable and heartbreaking about that persistence. Cathy had spent more than 40 years fighting an argument she could not win, because the book and the film had captured the public imagination in a way that no number of interviews or lawsuits or personal testimonies could reverse. She had lost her brother, her twin sister, and her mother, and still she stood before microphones and cameras and said the same thing she had been saying since 1978. My mother was not what they say she was. Cathy died on October 17th, 2020, at the age of 72, of lung cancer. With her death, the generation of Crawford children who had directly known Joan was reduced to one person. The defense of Joan Crawford's motherhood, which had been maintained by two living witnesses for decades, lost its last voice. Whatever Cathy knew, whatever private memories she carried of the house, the roles, the kitchen, the mornings, the mother who woke her and dressed her and sent her to school, the daily texture of a childhood that she insisted was not what Christina described. She carried it with her when she died. The memory is gone. It cannot be cross-examined, revisited, or verified. It exists now only in the interviews Cathy gave and the legal record of the defamation suit and the handful of public statements she made across 4 decades of a fight she never stopped believing she could win. Whether that faith was justified or futile depends, as everything in this story depends, on which version of Joan Crawford you believe was the real one. The cultural afterlife of Mommie Dearest grew so enormous that it eventually became impossible to see the real family behind it. The book became a phrase, shorthand in tabloid headlines, comedy routines, drag performances, and everyday conversation whenever maternal cruelty needed a quick label. The film, dismissed by critics on its release, acquired a cult following that deepened with every passing decade. Midnight screenings attracted crowds who shouted Faye Dunaway's most operatic line readings back at the screen, turning one woman's account of childhood abuse into participatory entertainment, an audience sport in which the pain was real but the consumption of it was not. The wire hanger image became a meme before the technology for memes existed, a GIF before the format existed, a piece of American cultural furniture so familiar that people who had never read the book, never seen the film, and could not have named Joan Crawford's filmography with a gun to their head knew exactly what the phrase "Mommie Dearest" meant. The paradox of that cultural afterlife is this. It simultaneously preserved Christina's allegations and trivialized them. The book was serious. The film turned the seriousness into spectacle. The spectacle was consumed as camp. And camp, whatever its other virtues, is not a medium that treats its subject with the gravity that abuse requires. Joan Crawford's motherhood became a joke, and the joke traveled so far and so fast that the actual question, what happened to 4 children inside that house, got lost inside its own cultural echo. The argument stopped being about the family and started being about the argument itself. And the people who had lived through it became characters in a story the public owned. In 2024, an HBO documentary titled Faye examined Dunaway's career, and the Mommie Dearest film surfaced once more. Its controversy, its cult status, the coat hanger scene that had followed Dunaway through her professional life, the same way it had followed Joan's memory through the decades. The documentary confirmed what had been evident for years. The Crawford family story was no longer a family story. It was an American cultural artifact, owned by everyone and controlled by no one. The institutions that shaped this family each left their mark on the story's outcome. Hollywood publicity protected Joan's image while she lived, ensuring that no interviewer asked the hard questions and no journalist investigated the household behind the carefully arranged photographs. The adoption system of the 1940s delivered children to Joan without the oversight that might have tracked their welfare, questioned the arrangements, or intervened when the first signs of a difficulty appeared. The publishing industry in the 1970s recognized the commercial potential of Christina's pain and gave it a platform that reached millions. The film industry recognized the commercial potential of the book and gave it a visual life that proved impossible to contain, control, or walk back. And the legal system processed the will contest and the defamation suit without ever settling the question underneath both of them. Because that question, the question of what actually happened behind Joan Crawford's closed doors, was never a legal matter. It was a family matter, and families do not deliver verdicts. They deliver competing stories, and the stories outlive the people who told them, and the people who could have corrected them, and the people who never wanted to be part of them in the first place. What remains is this. Christina Crawford is the only one of Joan's 4 adopted children still living. She is in her mid-80s. Christopher died in 2006 at 63. Cindy died in 2007 at 60. Cathy died in 2020 at 72. 3 of the 4 children are gone, and with each death, the story lost a witness. Someone who had actually stood in those rooms, actually heard Joan's voice, actually experienced whatever it was that each of them experienced and spent the rest of their lives trying to make the world understand. The family never reconciled. Not publicly, not privately, not in any form that has been documented or reported. No moment arrived when the surviving children sat together in a room and arrived at a shared account of what their mother had been. No mediator, no interviewer, no legal proceeding ever produced a version of the Crawford household that all parties could accept as accurate. The name remains divided along the same fault line it has been divided along since 1978. Joan the movie star. Joan the alleged abuser. Joan the mother Cathy and Cindy described and loved and mourned. Joan the mother Christina put on the page and would not take back. The public image that took a lifetime to build. The book that dismantled it in a single publishing season. And no resolution in sight because the people who could have provided one are almost all gone, and the one who remains has never shown any inclination to offer one. Cathy once said something that may be the most honest sentence anyone in the family ever offered about why the four of them could never agree. She said they had all lived in the same house, but not the same home. Joan Crawford built herself through discipline and image. She came from nothing, invented a name, constructed a career, adopted 4 children, and maintained a public face so complete that the world mistook it for the whole of her. Her children inherited the discipline and the image both, and what each of them did with that inheritance defined their lives. Christina inherited the wound and turned it into testimony she refused to retract. Christopher inherited the wound and carried it in silence until he was gone. Cathy and Cindy inherited the defense and held it as long as they had breath to hold it. And the public inherited an argument it still treats like a trial. Decades after the last witness who might have settled it chose not to speak.